At the far edge of the Dakota Plains, where the morning light rose slow as a tired promise, Wyatt Crowder's ranch sat in a hush so complete it felt like the world had forgotten to breathe. Dust drifted through the first pale beams like wandering spirits, brushing over the warped porch boards and slipping into the cracks of the battered doorway. The air smelled of cold earth and old memories, both heavy, both lingering longer than welcome. Folks said Wyatt had been born with silence braided into his bones, a man who looked at the horizon not with hope, but with the steady resignation of someone waiting for nothing. Yet that morning as he stepped outside with a mug of bitter coffee, something thin and restless tugged at the edges of his awareness, as if the land itself were whispering of a change he could not yet name, and it made him pause on the porch, one heartbeat longer than usual, wondering what was coming for him next. Silas Boone had made a fool's grin of his own face the day before, clapping Wyatt on the back and telling him he'd found someone to dust off the ghosts in the ranch house. Wyatt had ignored him then. Silas joked too often, especially when drink loosened the hinges of his mouth. But Silas had insisted loudly that Wyatt needed help, and louder still that it'd be funny to bring in the quiet widow from the river's edge. Wyatt hadn't laughed. He didn't laugh much anymore. And now, as hooves approached through the morning hush, he felt a ripple of dread, thin, sharp, unfamiliar, curl up the back of his neck, as if the world had tricked him into expecting solitude forever, only to pull the rug away when he least wanted the company. The figure who rode into view was small, steady, wrapped in a blanket patterned in river gray and sunset red. Ayanna Redbird dismounted with the fluid stillness of someone who lived more in listening than in speaking. Her dark braid hung down her back like a quiet line of ink, and her eyes, sharp, unreadable, took in Wyatt, the porch, the ranch, the unspoken question in the air. She looked young enough to still hold hope, but her posture carried the depth of grief most people never lived long enough to understand. Wyatt felt something twist in his chest at the sight of her, a tightness pulled from a place he kept locked far beneath the surface. He didn't know why her presence unsettled him, only that standing before her made the ranch feel smaller, as if every secret in the house had suddenly become visible, waiting to be uncovered by those steady eyes, and he couldn't yet decide whether he wanted to run or bow his head. "I was told you needed help," she said, her voice soft as dusk against pine bark. She didn't smile, didn't flinch, didn't look away. Wyatt swallowed once, twice, unsure whether to curse Silas for meddling or himself for feeling stripped bare under a stranger's gaze. He managed a grunt, a nod maybe, and stepped aside. When Ayanna crossed the threshold, she paused, taking in the dim room, the stale smell of disuse, the dust layered over every surface. Wyatt waited for judgment, a quick slice of disdain or pity, something to rake across the raw wound he'd learned to hide. But she only exhaled slowly, like someone seeing something familiar rather than something broken, and that quiet understanding rattled him more than any insult could have, leaving him standing in the doorway, unsure of what she had already noticed. She moved with measured grace through the dim kitchen first, her fingers ghosting along the counter, tracing the patterns of dust as though reading a story written in neglect. Wyatt watched her shoulders rise and fall with a calm that matched the rhythm of the drifting motes around her. The house felt different with her inside it, less empty, somehow less echoing. She opened a cupboard, inside, and used plates stacked like remnants of a life that had once meant something. Her gaze flicked toward a pair of boots by the back door, cracked and worn, untouched since the day Wyatt had refused to pick them up. His breath caught, shame firing hot beneath his ribs, but she said nothing. Instead, she gave a small nod, one that carried no pity, only recognition, maybe even respect. It confused him deeply, and he found himself wondering how she could see him so clearly when he had spent years trying to make himself invisible. "What do you want cleaned first?" she asked at last. Her words were simple, but they slipped past his defenses like warm water through cold fingers. Wyatt hesitated, looking around the cluttered room as if seeing it for the first time, realizing how much of his loneliness had settled into the corners. He almost said nothing, almost sent her away, almost chose the safety of solitude over the unease of being witnessed. But something unsteady kept him still, and he muttered, "Wherever you think best." Her eyes softened, just barely, and he felt a thrum of curiosity. Why that small shift in her expression struck him like a spark along dry timber, why he suddenly cared what she thought of this place and the man who lived inside it. By midday the whispers had already begun in town. Martha Ellery, with her sharp tongue and sharper glances, stood behind her shop counter telling anyone who would listen that Wyatt had hired that native widow from the river, as if the words themselves were scandal enough to sour the air. Folks murmured that Wyatt had lost his sense, that grief had made him reckless, that a woman like Ayanna didn't belong on a ranch owned by a man with Crowder blood. Even Sheriff Dalton Briggs, leaning by the doorway with his arms crossed, listened without speaking, his expression unreadable. Wyatt had never cared about gossip before. Let them talk, he'd always said, but now every whispered word felt like a stone thrown in Ayana's direction. And when he returned from the feed store and saw her sweeping the porch with calm conviction, head held high despite the eyes that burned holes into her spine from the road, a slow, unexpected anger stirred in him, leaving him uneasy with his own sudden need to shield her. Ayana ignored the watching faces, sweeping dust off the steps while the wind played through her hair. She hummed, barely audible, something low, lilting, shaped like longing. Wyatt stood at the doorway again, arms crossed, not sure whether to interrupt or simply listen. She worked not like someone hired for chores, but like someone restoring quiet dignity to a space that had forgotten it ever possessed any. Wyatt found himself tracing the movement of her hands, the soft shift of her shoulders, the way the late afternoon sun caught the edge of her braid. He felt ridiculous for noticing, foolish for caring, yet unable to look away. When he set a cup of coffee on the porch rail beside her without a word, she didn't look startled. She only nodded as if that simple gesture mattered more than anything he could have said. And when her fingers brushed his as she took the cup, barely, his breath hitched just enough to betray him, and he wondered, with quiet bewilderment, what this unfamiliar ache in his chest might become if he let it grow. Later, inside the house, she paused by a small frame on the mantel, a picture of a boy with Wyatt's eyes and a grin too wide for his young face. Dust clung to the glass, softening the edges of the smile. Ayana lifted the frame with care, her fingers steady. "Your brother?" she said quietly, not asking, only understanding. Wyatt stiffened, every muscle locking down. He hadn't spoken the boy's name aloud in years, hadn't allowed himself to touch that grief. "Barn accident," he muttered, the words rusted and reluctant. "My fault." Ayana set the frame down gently, turning toward him with eyes that felt like the first warm day after a long winter, still cold around the edges, but carrying the promise of thaw. "My husband died in an explosion on the rails," she said, voice steady as braided rope. "The town blamed my people. I blamed myself." For a moment, their tragedies hung between them like two branches from the same broken tree, and Wyatt felt the ground shift beneath the weight of shared sorrow, pulling them into a quiet understanding that neither of them had asked for but both strangely needed. That understanding was tested sooner than expected. The next afternoon, several townsfolk gathered at the ranch gate, Martha Ellery at the front, hands on her hips, lips pinched tight enough to split. "This isn't proper, Wyatt Crowder," she declared, her voice dripping judgment. "She doesn't belong here." Ayana stood behind Wyatt on the porch, still as stone, though her jaw tightened ever so slightly. Sheriff Briggs lingered nearby, caught between law and conscience. Wyatt felt a tremor run through him, the old instinct to retreat, to avoid conflict, to yield until nothing remained of himself. But when he glanced back at Ayana, at her quiet strength, something inside him steadied. He stepped forward with a controlled breath. "This is my land," he said, voice low but firm. "And she stays as long as she wishes." The murmurs rose like agitated bees. Ayana's gaze met his, surprised, touched, questioning, and he suddenly found himself wondering who he was becoming in her presence, and what other parts of himself he might uncover if he kept choosing this path. That night, the storm rolled in with a fury the plains hadn't tasted in months. Wind howled at the windows, rattling them like fists demanding entry. Rain hammered the roof so hard it felt like the sky was splitting open. Inside, lantern light flickered across Ayana's face as she checked the shutters, her braids swaying with each movement. Wyatt found her near the kitchen door when a gust slammed it open, sending a spray of rain across the floor and cutting his palm on the rusty latch as he wrestled it closed. She caught his hand before he could pull away, guiding him to sit while she cleaned the cut with tender precision. Her touch was warm, grounding, her breath slow as she worked in silence. Wyatt felt words pressing against his throat, thick and unwelcome, yet refusing to fade. At last, in a voice barely louder than the storm's sighs, he said, "I was the one who should have been in the barn that day. Not him." His voice cracked on the last word. Ayana didn't flinch. She laid her palm over his, steady and sure, as if lending him strength she could not afford to spare. A branch struck the roof outside with a sharp crack, but neither of them moved, held in the fragile calm of shared pain and offered grace. When dawn broke, the world glistened with the sheen of renewal. The storm had washed the dust from the porch, rinsed the fields, softened the sharp lines of the horizon. Wyatt stepped outside and found Ayana already there, hanging a small wind chime carved from bone and river stones, something she had carried with her since the night she lost everything. He hesitated, then lifted a small piece of polished wood he had shaped in the quiet hours before sunrise, crafted to replace the missing chime piece she had once mentioned losing. He held it out, awkward, uncertain. Ayana took it with gentle reverence, attaching it with slow hands. When the wind stirred, the chime sang a soft, trembling song, one filled with the sound of new beginnings rather than old sorrow. She met his gaze then, and though no words passed between them, something unspoken settled into the space between their breaths, warm, fragile, real. Wyatt realized in that quiet moment that he was no longer waiting for her to leave. And Ayana, standing with the dawn painting her face in gold, no longer looked like someone preparing to continue her wandering. The world felt paused, just for a breath, letting them exist in a place where healing was not a promise but a slow, steady act of choosing each other in small ways. Their future wasn't decided, not yet, not fully, but the air between them held the soft ache of possibility, tender and unhurried, like the first note of a song waiting to unfold, and somewhere deep inside, Wyatt felt the first flicker of hope he hadn't dared claim in years. If you find yourself standing on the threshold of change someday, wondering whether to open the door or retreat into the comfort of silence, remember that sometimes the heart heals not through declarations, but through simple acts of presence. A swept porch, a shared cup of coffee, a repaired wind chime. Let the small mercies matter. Let them guide you gently toward the unexpected, and trust that the quiet courage to let someone in might just be the beginning of your own return to the light.